Hi there, welcome to the third lecture on colonization and exploration. I sort of touched on the British, the Dutch, and the French at the end of the last walkthrough here, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the slave trade here and what happens here. You know, the origins of it goes back for a long time. There's a long history of slavery in Africa, but the international slave trade really comes out of the need for the slave labor on sugarcane and on plantations. And it grows over time. The misconception of the slave trade is that Europeans went in and kidnapped people and took them off to the New World. The reality was this was part of a trade. Now, numbers on this vary. Here we have up to 10 million cited African slaves taken to the Americas. The largest number of those go to Brazil. And Brazil arguably has the worst conditions of all of them. But the slave trade itself is carried out as part of trade. So tribes that live along the coast are making raids inland. They're kidnapping people from the interior, or they're not really totally interior, but a little bit of the interior of Africa, trading them to European traders for guns and manufactured goods and things like that. There is, of course, the Middle Passage where these slaves are taken from Africa to the New World, and there is a high death rate, largely because they're viewed more as cargo than as people. And what happens with the slave trade is that usually these are prisoners of war initially, but then there becomes sort of a real business side to this. So while it does depopulate a lot of African kingdoms, but this is what I was talking about. This is sort of the role of the African middlemen that gets overlooked sometimes when we learn about the slave trade here in the United States. The effects are too numerous to be named. I mean, this is an absolutely horrible history, period, in the history of the world. But you can see sort of that there becomes this trade between the three sort of worlds, you might say, the New World and Europe and Africa, and you have sugar and coffee, tobacco, things like that, silver coming this way. Going down here, you have things like guns and other technologies, and then coming across here, it's largely slaves that are going there. And here you can see slave sales being depicted at the time. You know, here's someone selling these people who have been slaved, Europeans buying them from some trader as we go along. So now we move over to Southeast Asia, which I'm just going to touch on Asia real quickly, just so it's in your heads, but probably not something that's going to be emphasized on the AP exam. The Portuguese can't really hold on to what they have in Southeast Asia because, I mean, really they're just stretched in the limits. They're a tiny country and they can't really hold on to this. Spain focuses on the Philippines, and the Dutch really consolidate a lot of military control here. The English have their parts of Southeast Asia that they're going to move into, but the Dutch are really going to be the big players for a long time. There are some places like Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam which maintain their sovereignty despite European attempts to colonize them. And so here you can see these are the Spice Islands where all of this is really coming from and where the big fighting is over. Yeah, Philippines here where Spain's. And here you can see like what happens with European influence, especially with the technology that they bring and the wealth that they bring, is that you start to see European style areas show up in Asia, mimicking the success of the Europeans. And you can see nicely laid out areas here. Sometimes they're given, European countries are given areas on the coast to work as trading ports, and they're all nicely laid out in order to make them nice and useful. But yeah, of course, there's the question of now, India becomes really big in terms of colonization. Originally, the Mughal Empire, which is a Muslim empire, rules this. But as Western powers come in, they start to take over. Now, the Portuguese, of course, are the first ones. They start trading. But Portugal can't hold on to anything, and so this brings in the big powers: the English, the Dutch, and the French. And they all are going to compete over this. But it's the East India Company, the British East India Company, that's going to be really successful here, force the withdrawal of the French, eventually take over from the areas from the Dutch, and eventually India is going to be sort of like the crown jewel of the entire British Empire. And you can see here where settlements happen early on, and the influence of Europeans. In China, you have some changes going on with the dynastic shift here, where Europeans are pressuring the Chinese to trade and all of this. The Chinese resist this. In Japan, it opens up. Initially, there's a real welcoming of traders and stuff like that, but then they start seeing that, when people come in, they bring with them elements of their culture. The Japanese don't like this, and so they decide to just, kick everybody out. And here you have how large the Qing Empire in China becomes, along with these tributary states that look over. And here you have a depiction from the Japanese perspective of the Portuguese arriving and trading and things like that. Now, conflicts happen because you have overlapping questions of who owns what and what shipping lanes and all of this. When you've got Spanish settlements in Cuba and Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, then you have French settlements here in San Domingue, and then English settlements in Jamaica, and then all you got these ships that are moving around between here, and there's all kinds of, this becomes like the golden age of the pirates and Jack Sparrow, those guys. But really the story, and not the really exciting super, we're going to make movies about this kind of story, is the story of trade. And sugar, it becomes really one of maybe the biggest export from the Caribbean. And the sugar mills use heavy use of native labor in order to do this labor-intensive process of creating sugar, which is something that today we take for granted, but which then was very valuable. So brief chronology here. Not a lot of dates that I would say that you need to know as an American. That's probably a good one to know right there, Jamestown. But for the most of this, you're not really going to need to know it. As long as you see the development here, where you go from Portuguese, and then you end up with, the British taking over most of this. Now, what's the impact? Well, on the conquered peoples, there's a lot here. There's a lot of devastating effects to local populations. Largely, this is due to disease, but certainly there are many other aspects of colonization which lead to devastating effects. There's less so in Asia simply because it's not colonized as much as the Americas, and they're not taking slaves like they are in Africa. It does create a very multiracial society in Latin America. And it is stratified, like I talked about in my last lecture, so that you have, whites at the top, Europeans, and then all the way down. And then the ecology is affected because there are new crops, new livestock that come in. Cows have never been seen before. Horses have never been seen before. Mules, all of these things. And then crops that are brought over from the Old World that grow really well in the New World. Catholic missionaries, of course, make a huge impact especially in the Americas, because they go about and they convert the native populations. This is mostly Jesuits here, but they do set up things like hospitals, orphanages, schools, things like that. Go about converting people. But this, of course, brings up questions. If you create schools to teach, Catholic ideas and European ideals and stuff like that, you sacrifice native culture and native beliefs and all of that. And you really see the sort of decline, if not death, of some pretty old belief structures as a part of this. For the conquerors, there are also impacts here. Lots more opportunities, especially in a Europe which is ruled by social status and who you're born. Go to the New World, and there's opportunities to make your own way. The economic effects here means there's more gold, there's more silver, and there's this price revolution that goes on. I mean, you bring in a whole lot more metals, and guess what happens to prices? They go up. There is as much of a change for plants and animals in the old world as there is in the new, through the Columbian Exchange. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But I mean, corn, the tomato, those sorts of things have never been seen before in the old world, and they become very important. Chocolate, coffee, tea, all of this is imported. But it does serve to deepen European rivalries, because while these European countries are going out and they're creating these huge empires, they keep running into each other, like I talked about, and that creates these rivalries that are going to lead to a number of wars, or at least they're going to partially lead to numbers of new wars. And of course, there's a new view of the world. Mercator makes a map of the world showing how it is. And the psychological impact is maybe downplayed a little bit, but it really creates this view that Europeans are superior to peoples around the world because they so easily conquered all of these areas. Here we have a great picture. Now this is Jeremy Irons from a movie called The Mission. It's a really good movie. It's getting a little bit old these days, but it does show sort of the difficulty of missionary work there, and trying to save the souls of people and have political problems always in the way. I highly recommend The Mission. Anyway, here's a sort of a really good depiction of the Columbian Exchange, right? You have lots of crops that are exported to Europe, lots of plants exported there, and then there are crops that are transplanted to Europe. Potatoes, cocoa, corn, cane sugar, cotton, tobacco, and then all of these: tomatoes, peanuts, peppers, beans, squash, sweet potatoes, and manioc. And then coming from the old world, wheat. I mean, imagine the Great Plains without wheat. Grapevines, olive trees, horses, cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, and then, of course, lots and lots of disease, all-place disease. So by the 17th century, most of the world has been mapped pretty accurately. There's a little bit, if you look, this sort of western area is a little bit questionable, but this is sort of a depiction of how the world is, far better than the maps that we had before the expedition started. And so this begins a world economy. And this is going to be sort of a running theme of European history, this development of a global economy here. In the 16th century, you have this huge inflation due to the influx of silver, especially from the Spanish colonies. If everyone's out there looking for gold and silver and they bring it all back to Europe and they start spending it, then inflation is going to happen. But perhaps the biggest outcome of this is the idea of commercial capitalism and the success of the capitalist countries who established these joint stock trading companies that I've been discussing, and they create new economic institutions, national banks that can finance these expeditions, and then the idea of stock exchanges where you can buy into things like that. But of course, regardless of all of this and all of the money that's coming in, there is still a dependence on agriculture. As part of this. This is not yet a manufacturing economy. This is not yet an industrial economy. That will all come later. once again, just to drive this point home, mercantilism is sort of the driving economic idea here. And the ideas are these. Number one, there's a total volume of trade. It can't be changed. Anytime someone takes trade away from another country, they gain it for themselves. There's a net zero impact or net zero change. There is an importance of bullion or like solid metals. You want a favorable balance of trade so that you're bringing in more money than you're importing, or you're exporting more than you're importing. And number three, the state should be heavily involved in this. And so this move towards globalization, something that we're talking about even in today's world. I mean, transoceanic trade becomes huge. This increases trade between Europe as well. And so the whole pattern of trade gets Europe, Africa, the East, and the Americas locked into these huge trading networks that are going to sort of define everything that comes after. And so that's a brief overview of colonization and exploration. I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered here. You know, does this end up being a net good, or does this end up being a net bad for the world, for the people, for cultures? Well, those are the questions that historians like to answer, and those are the questions that you're going to have to struggle with. But for now, I'm going to leave you with those questions, and I'm going to sign off. Hope you enjoyed this. Have a nice day.